The night air over the lagoon was calm, and the water moved so slowly that it almost looked like glass. Somewhere far away, a small wooden boat tapped gently against a post, making a quiet rhythm that echoed through the darkness. If you had stood on the edge of the water 1,000 years ago, you would have wondered how anyone could ever build a city here. Because Venice should not exist. The land beneath the lagoon is soft mud. Not firm earth. Not rock. Just layers of wet sand, clay, and silt drifting slowly beneath shallow water. Most engineers, even today, would look at a place like this and say the same thing. You cannot build a city here, and yet, over centuries, people did exactly that. They built palaces that seemed to float. Churches made of marble and stone. Bell towers that stretched toward the sky. Entire neighborhoods balanced above water that rises and falls with the tides. But to understand how Venice became one of the strangest engineering achievements in human history, we must first imagine a very different time. A time when the Roman Empire was collapsing. Around the 5th century, northern Italy was not peaceful. Armies moved across the land again and again. Cities burned. Villages emptied. People who had lived on farms and in towns for generations suddenly found themselves searching for somewhere safe. And sometimes the safest place was the strangest place. The lagoon. At first, the lagoon was not a city. It was a scattered collection of muddy islands and marshes. Fishermen had visited these places for years, building small huts on wooden platforms. But no one had ever imagined living there permanently. The ground was unstable. The tides flooded everything. Salt water destroyed buildings. And storms could wash away entire settlements. But when invading armies swept across the mainland, the lagoon offered something valuable: protection. Large armies with horses and heavy equipment could not easily cross shallow water and mud. Ships could move through certain channels, but only if the sailors knew the safe routes. For the people fleeing violence, the lagoon became a natural fortress. Families arrived with what they could carry: wood, tools, small animals, pieces of their lives packed into boats. They built simple homes on the higher patches of land. They tied boats to wooden stakes pushed into the mud. And slowly, they began learning something important. The lagoon was difficult, but it was not impossible. If you understood the water, you could survive here, but surviving was one thing. Building a city was another. The real engineering challenge began when people started asking a very strange question. What if we could build on the water? To answer that question, the early builders of Venice developed one of the most unusual construction techniques ever used for a city. Instead of building directly on the muddy ground, they built forests beneath their buildings. Thousands and thousands of wooden piles. Long tree trunks were cut from forests far away in the mountains of northern Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia. Oak, alder, larch, and other strong woods were transported, down rivers and across the sea. Then workers hammered the wooden poles deep into the mud. One pole was not enough. 2 poles were not enough. Sometimes a single building required tens of thousands of wooden piles. Imagine the work involved. Workers standing in shallow water, swinging heavy hammers, driving tree trunks into mud again and again until the ground beneath them became a dense cluster of wood. These piles formed the hidden skeleton of Venice. And here's the strange part. Normally, wood rots in water. Over time it breaks down, eaten by bacteria and insects. But the mud of the Venetian lagoon contains very little oxygen. Without oxygen, the organisms that normally destroy wood cannot survive. So instead of rotting, the wooden piles slowly hardened. Minerals from the water seeped into the wood, turning it almost into stone. Some of the piles driven into the lagoon over 1,000 years ago are still there today, still holding up buildings. On top of the forest of wooden piles, builders placed thick wooden platforms. Above those platforms they laid layers of stone, and on top of the stone they finally built the walls. The result was a strange but effective foundation system. A city resting on millions of wooden legs. But foundations alone were not enough. A city also needs streets, and Venice had a problem. There was very little land. Instead of wide roads and open squares like other cities, Venice developed a completely different transportation system. Water became the main highway. Canals were deepened and widened so boats could move through them. Houses were built with doors opening directly onto the water. Deliveries arrived by boat instead of wagon. Even today, if you walk through Venice, you will notice something unusual. You will not hear cars. There are none. Ambulances are boats. Garbage trucks are boats. Delivery vans are boats. The city operates on water the same way other cities operate on asphalt roads. But creating a network of canals was not easy. The lagoon constantly shifts. Sandbars move. Tides reshape the land. To keep the waterways open, Venetians had to become experts in controlling water itself. They built stone walls along canals to prevent erosion. They dredged mud to keep channels deep enough for boats. They studied the behavior of tides and currents. Over time, Venice became one of the greatest centers of hydraulic engineering. In the medieval world, water was no longer just something surrounding the city. It became something the city actively managed, and this knowledge allowed Venice to grow. Slowly, island by island, the settlement expanded. Bridges connected neighborhoods. Markets appeared. Churches rose above the rooftops. The city that should not exist began turning into one of the richest trading centers in Europe. But Venice's strange engineering was not limited to foundations and canals. The city also faced another constant enemy, flooding. Because Venice sits only slightly above sea level, high tides regularly push seawater into the streets. This phenomenon is called acqua alta, meaning high water. During these events, large parts of the city become temporarily flooded. Today people walk on raised platforms. But in earlier centuries, Venetians had to design their buildings carefully to survive repeated floods. Many doors were built higher than street level. Ground floors often used stone instead of wood. Important living spaces were placed on upper floors. Architecture became a quiet adaptation to water. And while Venice was solving the problem of living in a lagoon, it was also expanding its power far beyond the water. By the Middle Ages, Venetian ships sailed across the Mediterranean Sea. They traded spices, silk, glass, and precious metals. Their merchants traveled to distant ports in the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East, and the wealth from this trade flowed back into the lagoon. With wealth came ambition. Grand palaces lined the canals. Churches covered in marble appeared. Bell towers rose above the city skyline. But every new building still required the same careful engineering. First the piles, then the platforms, then the stone. The process was slow, expensive, and complicated, yet somehow it worked. For centuries. And while Venice was mastering the art of building on mud and water, other civilizations were solving equally strange engineering problems in their own ways. Across medieval Europe and beyond, humans were constantly attempting things that seemed impossible. Massive cathedrals with ceilings higher than forests, castles balanced on cliffs, bridges stretching across deep rivers. Each project required new ideas, new tools, and sometimes a little bit of madness. Because building something that has never existed before always begins with someone willing to ask an unusual question. What if this could work? In Venice, that question created a floating city. But the story of unusual engineering does not end there. Far away from the quiet canals of Venice, builders in other parts of the world were also experimenting with bold ideas. Some worked. Some collapsed. Some remain mysterious even today. And if you listen carefully to the slow rhythm of water moving through the Venetian lagoon tonight, you might imagine the echoes of those early builders. Men standing in shallow water with heavy hammers. Tree trunks floating beside them. The sound of wood being driven into mud again and again. The beginning of a city that should never have existed, yet somehow still does. And as the moon rises slowly above the lagoon, reflecting softly in the calm canals, the strange forest beneath Venice continues holding the city quietly above the water, just as it has done for centuries. The water of the lagoon never truly sleeps. Even in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city seems completely still, the tides move slowly beneath the dark surface. The water rises, then falls, breathing in a rhythm that has continued for thousands of years, and the city of Venice breathes with it. If you were standing on a wooden dock many centuries ago, you might hear the soft creaking of ropes tied to boats, the distant splash of an oar, and perhaps the faint echo of hammers striking wood somewhere in the darkness. Because Venice was never finished. It was always being built, repaired, strengthened, and adjusted to the strange world in which it existed. The people who lived there understood something important. A city on water cannot remain still. It must constantly adapt. Every storm, every tide, every shift of the muddy seabed reminded them of that truth. But the more they worked with the lagoon, the more skilled they became at shaping it. By the early Middle Ages, Venice had begun to look less like a collection of scattered islands and more like a real city. Small wooden bridges connected narrow streets. Markets filled with merchants selling fish, bread, salt, and cloth. Boats drifted slowly through canals carrying barrels of wine and baskets of vegetables. And beneath all of it remained the silent forest of wooden piles. The builders of Venice eventually developed an organized system for construction. It was not random or chaotic. In fact, it was incredibly precise. First, workers had to choose the correct location. They studied the lagoon floor carefully, looking for places where the mud was thick enough to hold piles firmly, but stable enough to support the weight of buildings. Once a site was chosen, the real work began. Boat after boat arrived carrying timber from distant forests. Some logs were over 4 meters long. Others were shorter but thicker, depending on the structure they were meant to support. Workers stood on temporary platforms above the water and began driving the piles into the mud. The tools they used were simple but effective. Large wooden hammers, sometimes lifted by rope systems, were dropped repeatedly onto the top of each pole. Slowly, the pile sank deeper into the lagoon floor. Sometimes it took hundreds of strikes, sometimes more. The goal was to create a tightly packed cluster of wood. When enough piles were placed close together, they formed a stable base that could spread the weight of the building above. It was a slow and exhausting process. But over time, the builders became incredibly efficient. Entire neighborhoods were constructed using this method. After the piles were driven into place, a thick layer of wooden beams was laid across the top, forming a grid-like platform. Above that, builders placed heavy slabs of stone. One of the most common stones used in Venice came from a type of limestone called Istrian stone. This stone was incredibly valuable because it resisted saltwater erosion. Most stones slowly crumble when exposed to salt and moisture, but Istrian stone remained strong for centuries. Large blocks were transported by ship from quarries across the Adriatic Sea. Imagine the journey. Huge stone slabs resting inside wooden ships, slowly crossing the waves toward a city that itself floated on water. Once the stones arrived, they were carefully placed on top of the wooden platform foundations. Only then could the walls of buildings begin rising upward. But foundations were not the only engineering challenge facing Venice. The lagoon itself was constantly changing. Rivers flowing from the mainland carried sand and sediment toward the lagoon. Over time, these materials could fill the canals, turning deep water into shallow marshes. If that happened, ships would no longer be able to reach the city, trade would stop. Venice would lose its lifeline. So the Venetians did something bold. They changed the rivers. Instead of allowing rivers to naturally empty into the lagoon, engineers dug large diversion channels. Some rivers were moved miles away from their original paths. This was an enormous project, especially for medieval engineers without modern machinery. Workers used shovels, picks, and simple carts to reshape entire waterways. But the effort protected the lagoon. By keeping river sediment away, Venice ensured its canals remained navigable for ships. It was one of the earliest examples of large-scale environmental engineering in Europe. And it showed something remarkable about the Venetian mindset. They did not simply adapt to nature, they reshaped it. The city also became famous for its bridges. Today Venice has more than 400 bridges connecting its many islands. But early bridges were very different from the stone arches visitors see today. The first bridges were made of wood. Wooden bridges were easier and faster to build, but they had disadvantages. They could burn in fires, they rotted over time, and heavy crowds sometimes damaged them. As Venice grew wealthier, many wooden bridges were replaced with stone. One of the most famous examples is the Rialto Bridge. For centuries, the Rialto area was the heart of Venetian commerce. Merchants from across Europe and Asia came to buy and sell goods there. Originally, the bridge crossing the Grand Canal at Rialto was wooden. But in the 16th century, the city decided to replace it with a massive stone structure. Many architects believed the idea was impossible. The Grand Canal was wide, and the foundation beneath the water was unstable mud. Building a heavy stone bridge in such conditions seemed incredibly risky. Several famous architects submitted designs. Some proposed multiple arches. Others suggested lighter structures. In the end, the design chosen was bold and simple. A single massive stone arch spanning the canal. To support the weight of the bridge, engineers once again relied on the ancient Venetian technique of driving wooden piles deep into the mud. Thousands of piles were placed beneath the foundation. Then stone platforms were built above them. And finally, the great arch of the Rialto Bridge rose above the water. When it was completed in 1591, the bridge became one of the engineering wonders of the city. People crossed it every day without thinking about the thousands of wooden piles hidden beneath the canal. But the engineering genius of Venice did not stop at bridges and buildings. The city also developed one of the most advanced shipbuilding industries in the medieval world: the Venetian arsenal. If you had walked into the arsenal during its busiest years, you would have seen something astonishing. Ships being built at an almost unbelievable speed. The arsenal was not just a shipyard. It was something closer to an early industrial factory. Workers specialized in specific tasks. Some cut wood for hulls, others made ropes. Others forged metal nails and fittings. Sailmakers stitched enormous sails from heavy cloth. Instead of building one ship from start to finish, the process was divided into stages. Parts moved from one group of workers to another. This system allowed ships to be constructed far faster than traditional methods. Some historians believe the arsenal could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day during emergencies. For the medieval world, that level of organization was extraordinary. And it gave Venice a powerful navy that protected its trade routes across the Mediterranean. Yet even with all this engineering brilliance, Venice remained vulnerable. The sea was always present. Storms occasionally pushed waves into the lagoon with great force. High tides flooded streets. And the slow sinking of the city itself became a concern. Yes, Venice has always been sinking. Not quickly, but slowly. The mud beneath the city compresses under the weight of buildings. Over centuries, the ground settles slightly lower. Combined with rising sea levels, this creates increasing flooding problems. In modern times, engineers have attempted to solve this issue with large, movable flood barriers known as the Mose system. But centuries before modern technology, Venetians relied on careful architecture and constant maintenance to survive. Buildings were repaired. Canal walls were reinforced. New techniques were invented again and again. And perhaps that is the true secret of Venice's engineering success. It was never a single invention. It was a continuous process of learning. Generation after generation studied the lagoon, observing how water moved, how buildings aged, how storms behaved. Knowledge passed from master builders to apprentices. Ideas improved slowly over time. And while Venice perfected the art of building a city on water, other parts of the medieval world were experimenting with equally fascinating engineering ideas. Far to the north, builders were constructing enormous Gothic cathedrals, whose ceilings reached heights no one had previously imagined. Stone vaults seemed to float above vast open spaces. Light poured through stained glass windows. But supporting such enormous structures required new inventions like flying buttresses, external supports that carried the weight of the roof away from the walls. Meanwhile, in other regions, engineers were designing massive castle fortifications with complex defensive systems. Moats, drawbridges, hidden passageways, thick stone walls built to resist siege weapons. Each civilization faced different challenges, and each developed unique solutions. But few places combine natural difficulty and human determination quite like Venice. Because Venice was not just a city built in a difficult place. It was a city built in a place where most people would never even attempt to build. A quiet lagoon of mud and shifting water. Yet through patience, creativity, and centuries of engineering effort, it became one of the most extraordinary cities in history. And tonight, as the moonlight reflects off the slow-moving canals, the foundations of that impossible city remain hidden beneath the water. Millions of wooden piles standing silently in the dark mud below, holding up palaces, churches, bridges, and the footsteps of everyone who walks the narrow streets above. A forest beneath the sea, patiently supporting a dream that began more than 1,000 years ago. And somewhere in the gentle movement of the tide, you might imagine the faint echo of those early builders still working, still hammering wood into mud, slowly creating a city where no city should have been. The lagoon continues breathing quietly. And the strange engineering of Venice continues holding the city above the water, just as it always has. The lagoon surrounding Venice has always been quiet in a particular way. Not silent, because there are always small sounds. The soft slap of water against stone, the creaking of wooden docks, the distant call of a seabird drifting through the cool night air. But it is a quiet that feels slow and patient, as if the water itself understands that the city resting above it was built over many centuries. If someone from the early Middle Ages could return today and stand beside one of the canals, they might feel a sense of wonder. The buildings would look grander, the bridges stronger, and the streets busier than they ever imagined. Yet beneath all of that progress, the secret structure of the city would remain familiar. The wooden piles still stand in the mud. They cannot be seen, but they support almost everything. And this strange hidden forest is perhaps one of the most fascinating examples of medieval engineering. When modern scientists examined some of the piles during restoration work, they made an interesting discovery. Many of the wooden poles had not decayed at all, even after centuries underwater. Instead, minerals carried by the lagoon water had slowly entered the wood cells. Over time, the wood had hardened. In some cases, it had become almost as strong as stone. This process happened naturally because of the unusual environment beneath the lagoon floor. Without oxygen, the tiny organisms that normally break down woods simply could not survive. The result was a quiet transformation. Tree trunks that once stood in distant forests became permanent pillars beneath a floating city. But even though the piles themselves were strong, Venetian engineers understood that the city would always need care. Maintenance became a normal part of life. Canal walls were inspected. Buildings were repaired. Stone blocks were replaced when they cracked. The city functioned almost like a living organism, constantly adjusting itself to remain balanced above the water. And balance was incredibly important, because Venice did not sit on one single island. It spread across more than 100 small islands within the lagoon. These islands were connected by bridges and narrow streets, creating a complex network that could be confusing even for visitors today. Yet for the people who lived there, the layout made perfect sense. Each island developed its own small neighborhoods, markets, and churches. Boats replaced horses and carts. Water replaced roads. If you wanted to visit a friend in another district, you might walk across a few bridges or step into a small boat and glide quietly through the canals. In fact, some of the most famous boats in Venice, the gondolas, were specifically designed to move easily through the narrow waterways. The gondola has a very unusual shape. One side of the boat is slightly longer than the other. This asymmetry helps the gondolier row efficiently while standing on one side of the boat. The design allows smooth movement through tight canals and under low bridges. It is another example of how Venetian engineering adapted perfectly to the environment. Even small details were carefully considered. But the city's greatest challenges were not always structural. Sometimes they were environmental. The lagoon is a delicate ecosystem. If too much sediment enters the water, canals fill up and become marshland. If tides become too strong, flooding becomes more frequent. The Venetians understood this balance very early in their history. That is why they worked so hard to control the rivers that flowed toward the lagoon. Several rivers originally carried large amounts of sand and mud into the lagoon basin. Over time, this could have transformed the area into dry land or swamp. So Venetian engineers redirected the rivers. It was an enormous project that took many decades. Workers dug long canals and diversion channels to carry river water directly into the Adriatic Sea instead of the lagoon. This decision preserved the deep waterways that allowed ships to reach the city. Without that engineering effort, Venice might have slowly disappeared beneath layers of sediment. Instead, it continued to grow into one of the most important trading cities in the medieval world. Merchants arrived from distant lands carrying spices, silk, precious metals, and rare goods. Markets filled with languages from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Ships lined the docks along the Grand Canal. The wealth created by this trade allowed Venice to invest even more in architecture and engineering. And perhaps the most beautiful result of that wealth can still be seen in the city's palaces. Many Venetian palaces were built directly along canals. Their entrances faced the water because boats were the primary form of transportation. From the canal, these buildings appear incredibly elegant. Tall windows, decorative stone arches, balconies overlooking the water. But their beauty hides the incredible effort required to build them. Every palace began the same way. First the piles, then the wooden platform, then the stone foundation, then the walls rising slowly upward. Some palaces required tens of thousands of wooden piles beneath them. It is easy to forget this when looking at the graceful architecture above the waterline. Yet the entire structure depends on the hidden work below. Perhaps one of the most famous buildings in Venice is St. Mark's Basilica. Its golden mosaics and domes have amazed visitors for centuries. But the church itself rests on the same unusual foundations as the rest of the city. When construction began, engineers drove thousands of wooden piles into the lagoon floor to create a stable base. Above that base, they constructed thick stone platforms capable of supporting the enormous weight of the basilica. The result is a building that appears delicate and ornate, but is supported by an incredibly strong foundation system. Nearby stands another famous structure, the Campanile of St. Mark's. This tall bell tower rises high above the city skyline. But its history reminds us that even Venice's engineering could sometimes fail. In the year 1902, after centuries of standing proudly above the square, the tower suddenly collapsed. The structure had developed cracks over time, and eventually the entire tower gave way. Remarkably, the collapse caused very little loss of life because the area had been evacuated after warning signs appeared. Soon afterward, the decision was made to rebuild the tower exactly as it had looked before. The new campanile was completed in 1912, standing once again above the city. And like the original, it rests on foundations supported by wooden piles deep beneath the ground. Stories like this reveal something important about Venice. The city survives not because its engineering is perfect, but because people continue repairing, rebuilding, and maintaining it. The relationship between the city and the lagoon has always been dynamic. Each generation must care for what previous generations built. And while Venice mastered the art of building on water, other civilizations during the medieval period faced equally strange engineering challenges. In Northern Europe, builders attempted something extraordinary with stone cathedrals. They wanted their churches to reach incredible heights, filling the interior with light. But stone walls alone could not support such tall structures. If the walls were too thin, the roof would collapse. So architects invented a new system, flying buttresses. These elegant stone supports extended outward from the building, transferring the weight of the roof away from the walls and down into the ground. From the outside, flying buttresses look almost like stone arms reaching out from the cathedral. They allowed architects to build higher and higher while filling walls with stained glass windows. The result was a completely new style of architecture known as Gothic. Inside these cathedrals, visitors often feel a sense of awe. The ceilings soar upward. Colored light filters through enormous windows. And the entire structure feels both massive and delicate at the same time. Yet just like Venice's hidden wooden piles, the beauty of Gothic cathedrals depends on carefully calculated engineering hidden within the structure. Another fascinating medieval innovation appeared in the construction of castles. Castles were not only homes for nobles, they were defensive machines. Engineers designed thick walls capable of resisting siege weapons. They created moats filled with water to prevent attackers from reaching the walls. Drawbridges could be raised to block entrances. Some castles included complex gatehouses with multiple layers of defense. Attackers might pass through one gate only to face another behind it. Arrows could be fired from narrow slits in the walls, while defenders remained protected inside. Each part of the castle was carefully designed for both strength and strategy. Yet despite all these incredible structures across the medieval world, Venice remained unique. No other city depended so completely on water. No other city balanced itself on millions of wooden piles beneath a lagoon. And perhaps that is why Venice feels so mysterious to visitors even today. When you walk through its narrow streets at night, you might hear the gentle sound of water moving through the canals. You might cross a bridge and look down at the reflections of old buildings shimmering on the surface. And it is easy to forget that beneath those reflections lies an entire hidden system of engineering, wood buried in mud, stone resting on platforms, careful design developed over centuries, all quietly supporting the city above. The lagoon continues breathing with the slow rhythm of the tide. And the strange, patient engineering of Venice continues doing its silent work, just as it has done for hundreds of years, holding the city steady between land and sea, between history and the present, between the quiet depths below and the peaceful streets above. And as the night grows deeper and the water moves softly against the foundations, the hidden forest beneath Venice waits patiently in the dark mud, still carrying the weight of a city that once seemed impossible. The longer one spends thinking about Venice, the more unusual the city begins to seem. At first glance, it appears simply beautiful quiet canals, graceful bridges, and buildings whose reflections tremble softly on the surface of the water. But when you remember that the entire city stands on mud, supported by countless hidden wooden piles driven deep into the lagoon floor, the beauty begins to feel almost mysterious. How did people in the Middle Ages manage something so complex? The answer lies partly in patience. Medieval builders did not rush their work. Construction often lasted many years, sometimes decades. A single church might take generations to complete. Knowledge passed slowly from master craftsmen to apprentices, and techniques improved bit by bit over time. Venice was no exception. The difficulty of building on water forced Venetian builders to become extremely careful and methodical. Every structure required planning long before the first stone was placed. Workers had to transport materials through the lagoon using boats. Stone, timber, bricks, metal tools, everything arrived by water. Even sand for mortar had to be brought in carefully. Imagine the constant movement of cargo boats gliding through the canals during the busiest centuries of Venetian construction. Some boats carried long logs from alpine forests. Others carried blocks of pale limestone. Some were filled with bricks baked in kilns on the mainland. From dawn until dusk, the lagoon became a network of floating supply routes. And while construction continued above the water, another world of work took place beneath the surface. Divers were sometimes needed to inspect underwater foundations or repair damaged canal walls. Without modern diving equipment, this was extremely difficult work. Some divers used simple techniques such as weighted ropes and basic breathing methods to remain underwater for short periods. They worked quickly, feeling their way along stone blocks and wooden piles in the dark water. The canals themselves also required constant care. Sediment slowly accumulated at the bottom, carried by tides and small streams. If too much mud gathered, boats could run aground. So the Venetians developed dredging systems. Large buckets attached to simple cranes were lowered into the water to scoop out mud. Workers emptied the buckets into barges and transported the sediment away from the city. This process was repeated again and again, year after year. Without it, the canals would eventually have become shallow marshes. Another interesting challenge involved drinking water. Surrounded by salt water, Venice could not rely on nearby rivers or wells the way most cities did. Digging a deep well simply produced salty water from the lagoon. So the Venetians invented a clever solution: rainwater collection systems. In many squares, or campi as they are called in Venice, builders created underground cisterns designed to collect and filter rainwater. The surface of the square was slightly sloped, so rainwater flowed toward small openings covered by stone grates. Beneath those grates were layers of sand and gravel that filtered the water as it passed downward. The filtered water collected in a sealed underground chamber. At the center of the square stood a wellhead where residents could draw clean drinking water from the cistern below. It was a surprisingly advanced system for the time. Each neighborhood depended on these rainwater wells for daily life. And because the cisterns needed regular cleaning and maintenance, communities worked together to protect their water supply. Even the squares of Venice were carefully engineered. But perhaps the most fascinating engineering center in the city was still the Venetian arsenal. The arsenal was enormous by medieval standards. Its high brick walls surrounded an area filled with workshops, warehouses, and shipbuilding docks. At its peak, thousands of workers were employed there. Carpenters shaped the hulls of ships. Blacksmiths forged anchors, chains, and nails. Ropemakers twisted long strands of fiber into thick cables. Sailmakers stitched enormous triangular sails. The arsenal was famous not only for the quality of its ships, but also for the speed at which they could be produced. Instead of building one ship at a time, Venetian engineers organized the process almost like a moving assembly line. Different teams specialized in different parts of the ship. A hull might be constructed in one section of the yard, then moved to another area where masts and sails were added. In another area, weapons such as cannons and crossbows were installed. Finally, the ship would be stocked with supplies and launched into the lagoon. This organized system allowed Venice to build large fleets when necessary, especially during times of war. For many travelers visiting the city during the medieval period, the arsenal was one of the most impressive sights. Some described the sound of hundreds of workers hammering, sawing, and forging metal all at once. Smoke rose from furnaces. Timber stacks towered beside the docks. And ships slowly took shape in the water. The arsenal represented the industrial heart of Venice. Yet even with all this activity, the lagoon itself remained calm most of the time. Boats moved quietly along the canals. Gondoliers guided passengers through narrow waterways with smooth strokes of their oars. Merchants loaded cargo onto ships bound for distant ports. And in the evenings, when the work of the day ended, the city often returned to a peaceful silence. The water reflected lantern light from windows and doorways. Footsteps echoed softly along stone walkways. The tide continued its slow rhythm. But Venice's peaceful appearance sometimes hid a constant battle against natural forces. Storms in the Adriatic Sea could push enormous amounts of water toward the lagoon. When strong winds combined with high tides, the water level in Venice rose quickly. Streets flooded, squares filled with seawater. Boats drifted close to buildings that normally stood safely above the canal surface. These events reminded Venetians that the sea was never far away. To protect their city, they built sea defenses along the barrier islands separating the lagoon from the open sea. These islands' long, narrow strips of land acted as natural shields against waves and storms. Engineers reinforced them with stone walls and barriers to prevent erosion. Without these protective islands, powerful waves from the Adriatic might have swept directly into the lagoon. Maintaining the barrier islands became another important engineering task. Workers repaired damaged walls, replaced stones, and strengthened weak sections after storms. Again and again, the city relied on careful maintenance to survive. And perhaps this constant attention to engineering created a unique culture in Venice. People grew accustomed to thinking about water, foundations, and structures in ways that residents of other cities rarely considered. Children grew up seeing boats used as delivery vehicles. Merchants planned their businesses around canals rather than roads. Builders understood the delicate balance between land and water. This relationship shaped daily life. It also shaped the identity of the city itself. Venice became known not only for its beauty but also for its remarkable ability to exist in an environment where most cities could never survive. Travelers arriving by ship often described the same feeling. From a distance, the city appeared to rise directly from the water. Domes and towers emerged slowly on the horizon. The reflections of buildings shimmered on the surface of the lagoon. There were no city walls visible from afar, no farmland surrounding the settlement, only water and architecture. For many visitors, it felt almost magical. But of course, the reality was not magic. It was engineering. Patient, careful, centuries-long engineering. And while Venice continued perfecting its relationship with the lagoon, other parts of the medieval world were experimenting with bold construction ideas of their own. In mountainous regions, builders faced the challenge of creating roads and bridges across steep valleys. Stone arch bridges became one of the most reliable solutions. These bridges used carefully shaped stones arranged in an arch pattern. The central stone, known as the keystone, locked the entire structure together. When weight pressed down on the bridge, the forces traveled outward along the arch and into the supporting pillars. This design allowed bridges to support enormous weight without using modern materials. Many medieval stone bridges still stand today, quietly carrying travelers across rivers just as they did centuries ago. In desert regions, engineers developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Long underground channels called canaux carried water from distant mountains to dry farmland. These channels were dug with gentle slopes so water could flow naturally for many miles. Small vertical shafts along the route allowed workers to access the tunnel for maintenance. Canaux were incredibly effective and required no pumps or machinery. They relied entirely on gravity and careful planning. In colder climates, builders designed wooden houses with steep roofs to prevent heavy snow from accumulating. Every environment required different solutions. Every region developed its own traditions of engineering and architecture. But few places demanded creativity quite like Venice. Because Venice was not just adapting to its environment. It was balancing on it. The lagoon remained both protector and threat. Without the water, the city would never have been safe from invading armies. But with the water came constant engineering challenges, and so the quiet work continued. Wood driven into mud, stone placed carefully above hidden platforms. Canals dredged, walls repaired, islands strengthened. Generation after generation contributing to the same remarkable project. A city built where cities were never meant to stand. And tonight, as the moonlight spreads across the lagoon once again, the canals reflect the same gentle glow they have reflected for centuries. Boats drift slowly through the water. Bridges arch gracefully above narrow streets. And far below the surface, in the silent darkness of the lagoon floor, the ancient wooden piles continue their quiet task, holding Venice steady, holding history in place, supporting a dream that began with a few simple huts on muddy islands long ago. A dream that slowly grew into one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements the world has ever known. and the lagoon continues breathing softly beneath it all, rising, falling, patient as ever. As the quiet hours of night settle over the lagoon, Venice begins to feel almost timeless. The narrow streets grow still, footsteps fade, and the canals return to their slow, reflective calm. Lamps glow gently along the water, and the arches of old bridges cast soft shadows that ripple with each passing movement of the tide. If someone could watch the city from high above during such a quiet moment, they might notice something remarkable. Venice does not behave like most cities. There are no long highways filled with moving lights. There are no loud engines echoing through wide avenues. Instead, the movement of the city follows the water. Small boats glide quietly along the canals. Occasionally, a gondola drifts beneath a bridge. Somewhere in the distance, a water taxi moves across the Grand Canal, leaving a slow wake that gently rocks the boats tied beside the stone steps of old palaces. It is a rhythm shaped entirely by the lagoon. And this rhythm has influenced Venetian engineering for more than 1,000 years. Even the placement of buildings had to respect the water. When early builders selected a site for construction, they had to think carefully about tides, currents, and the flow of boats. Canals needed to remain wide enough for traffic. Bridges had to be high enough for vessels to pass beneath them. Space was always limited. So Venetian architects developed a unique style of narrow but tall buildings. Many houses rose several stories above the canal, their upper windows facing the light and breeze from the water. At ground level, entrances often opened directly onto the canal itself. Stone steps descended into the water so passengers could easily step into boats. This arrangement turned canals into the city's true streets. But building tall structures on such fragile foundations required careful weight distribution. Walls were often made of brick rather than solid stone, reducing the total load on the piles below. Decorative stone elements were added selectively, especially around windows and arches. Inside the buildings, wooden beams helped distribute weight across multiple walls rather than concentrating pressure in one location. These details might seem small, but together they allowed Venetian buildings to remain stable despite the soft ground beneath them. And stability was something the city constantly worked to maintain. Over the centuries, engineers noticed that some areas of Venice were slowly sinking. This happened partly because the muddy soil compressed under the weight of buildings. It also occurred because natural geological processes slowly lowered parts of the lagoon. The sinking was gradual, only a few millimeters over many years, but over centuries it became noticeable. Streets that once remained dry during high tides began flooding more frequently. Doorways that were originally above water level gradually moved closer to the surface of the canals. In response, Venetians raised certain walkways and reinforced important structures. The city adapted again. This pattern repeated throughout Venice's history. A challenge appeared. Engineers studied the problem. A solution slowly emerged. Sometimes the solution worked perfectly, sometimes it needed improvement. But the process never truly stopped. Venice became a city shaped by constant observation and adjustment. Even the design of the famous gondola reflects this spirit of adaptation. At first glance, a gondola appears simple, a long, narrow black boat with a curved front and back. But its shape is actually the result of centuries of experimentation. The hull is slightly curved along its length, helping it glide smoothly through the water. The bottom is nearly flat, allowing it to navigate shallow canals. And perhaps most interestingly, the boat is intentionally asymmetrical. One side is slightly longer than the other. This design compensates for the gondolier's position while rowing. Because the gondolier stands on one side of the boat, the uneven shape helps keep the vessel moving straight. Without this subtle adjustment, the gondola would constantly turn in circles. Small innovations like this reveal how deeply Venetians understood their watery environment. But boats and buildings were only part of the story. The city also depended on a vast network of trade routes, stretching across the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. Ships departing Venice carried goods to ports in Greece, North Africa, and the Middle East. They returned with spices, fabrics, precious stones, and exotic materials rarely seen in Europe. Managing this trade required advanced navigation skills and reliable ship construction. Once again, the Venetian arsenal played a crucial role. The arsenal's shipbuilders became famous throughout Europe for their efficiency and craftsmanship. Large warships known as galleys were among their most important creations. Galleys were long, narrow ships powered primarily by rows of oars. Each side of the ship contained dozens of oarsmen working in rhythm to move the vessel quickly through the water. This design allowed Venetian fleets to travel even when winds were calm. It also made galleys highly maneuverable during naval battles. The construction of such ships required enormous quantities of timber. Forests in northern Italy and neighboring regions were carefully managed to supply the arsenal with wood. Logs floated down rivers toward the sea, where they were collected and transported to Venice. Once inside the arsenal, the wood was cut, shaped, and assembled into hulls and masts. Iron fittings, ropes, sails, and weapons were added step by step. The process resembled a carefully organized machine long before the age of modern factories. Visitors who saw the arsenal during its busiest periods often described it with amazement. Some compared it to a city within a city. Workshops stretched across large areas. Docks held ships in various stages of construction. Warehouses stored materials and finished equipment. The sound of hammering echoed constantly. Yet beyond the arsenal's busy walls, Venice continued its quiet existence on the water. Life followed familiar patterns. Merchants opened shops along narrow streets. Fish markets filled with the day's catch from the lagoon and the sea. Artisans crafted glass, textiles, and jewelry that would later travel to distant lands. And everywhere, the canals served as the main pathways connecting these activities. But canals brought their own engineering challenges. Water levels changed with the tides, sometimes rising unexpectedly. Strong winds could push waves through narrow waterways. Boat traffic occasionally damaged canal walls. To manage these issues, Venice maintained a complex system of stone embankments lining the canals. These walls prevented erosion and helped keep the water channels stable. Many of the stones used for this purpose were made of durable Istrian limestone, the same material used in the foundations of major buildings. The stone resisted salt water and remained strong even after centuries of exposure. Still, repairs were always necessary. Engineers inspected canal walls regularly, replacing damaged blocks and reinforcing weak sections. Workers used barges to transport stones and equipment through the canals. Piece by piece, the infrastructure of the city was maintained. And while Venice continued perfecting its watery engineering, the medieval world beyond the lagoon was filled with equally fascinating construction efforts. Across Europe, builders attempted to create roads capable of carrying heavy wagons over long distances. Roman roads had once connected vast regions, but many fell into disrepair after the empire declined. Medieval engineers repaired old routes and constructed new ones where possible. Stone paving, drainage ditches, and raised roadbeds helped protect pathways from rain and mud. In mountainous regions, narrow passes required careful construction to prevent landslides. Elsewhere, monasteries developed advanced agricultural systems. Terraced hillsides allowed crops to grow on steep slopes. Watermills used flowing rivers to grind grain into flour. These mills represented another clever use of natural forces. Instead of relying on human or animal power, the turning wheel of a watermill captured energy directly from the river's current. Inside the mill, gears transferred this motion to large grinding stones. Grain poured between the stones was crushed into fine flour. This technology dramatically increased food production across many regions. It also demonstrated the medieval fascination with harnessing natural energy. Windmills soon followed, using wind rather than water to turn their blades. Tall wooden towers with rotating sails appeared in flat landscapes where rivers were scarce. Each turning sail captured the invisible force of the wind and converted it into useful work. In many ways, these inventions reflected the same spirit that allowed Venice to thrive. Human creativity meeting environmental challenges. Careful observation leading to clever solutions. But perhaps Venice stands apart because its entire existence depends on such solutions. Without engineering, the city could not survive. Without constant maintenance, the lagoon would slowly reclaim the islands. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, Venice has continued to balance itself between water and land. Bridges still connect its islands. Boats still glide through its canals. The hidden forest of wooden piles still supports its buildings deep beneath the lagoon floor. Tonight, as the tide gently rises and falls, the city rests quietly above the water. The same quiet lagoon that once sheltered frightened refugees long ago now surrounds one of the most remarkable cities ever built. A city that required patience. A city that required imagination. A city that required engineering unlike anywhere else on Earth. And somewhere beneath the dark surface of the canals, the ancient wooden piles remain where they were first driven centuries ago. Silent, steady, holding Venice, carefully above the slow breathing of the sea. The night in Venice often feels different from the night in other cities. Perhaps it is the way sound travels across water, or the way the narrow streets quietly guide footsteps from one small square to another. Or perhaps it is the knowledge that beneath every building, beneath every bridge, beneath every stone walkway, the lagoon still waits patiently. The water never truly leaves. Even when the tide is low and the streets are dry, the lagoon rests only a short distance, below the surface. The city floats above it in a careful balance that has lasted for centuries. And that balance was never accidental. Every generation of Venetians learned to watch the water closely. They studied the direction of currents. They measured the rise and fall of tides. They observed how storms affected the barrier islands that protected the lagoon from the open Adriatic Sea. In time, this careful observation became a tradition of knowledge. Venetian engineers kept records of tides and floods. They discussed problems and possible solutions. They experimented with new building techniques and methods of reinforcing the canals. Their work was not always dramatic or visible. Often it was slow, quiet maintenance. But over long periods of time, these small efforts shaped the survival of the city. One of the most important parts of this system was the lagoon itself. The lagoon is not simply open water. It is a complex environment made of shallow channels, mudflats, salt marshes, and small islands. Some areas are deep enough for ships. Others are so shallow that only small boats can pass. The shape of the lagoon changes slowly as tides move sand and mud from place to place. If left completely untouched, nature would eventually transform the lagoon into dry land or marsh. Venetians understood this risk. That is why they worked so hard to control the rivers and sediments flowing toward the lagoon. The diversion of rivers was one of the largest environmental engineering efforts in medieval Europe. Instead of allowing rivers to naturally enter the lagoon, engineers dug canals that redirected them directly into the Adriatic Sea. This prevented large amounts of sand and mud from filling the lagoon basin. Without this effort, Venice might have become surrounded by marshland within a few centuries. Instead, the waterways remained open for trade. Ships could still reach the city. Merchants continued arriving with goods from distant places, and the wealth of Venice continued growing. With wealth came ambition. The city began constructing grand buildings that reflected its power and success. Palaces rose along the Grand Canal with elegant arches and balconies overlooking the water. Churches filled with artwork and marble appeared in quiet neighborhoods. Public buildings and government halls demonstrated the authority of the Venetian Republic. Yet even the most magnificent structures still depended on the same simple foundation system used by the earliest settlers. Wooden piles, platforms, stone. It is almost surprising how something so simple could support something so grand. But sometimes the best engineering solutions are the simplest ones. A forest of wood hidden beneath the city, strong enough to carry centuries of history. Of course, engineering in Venice was not only about strength, it was also about understanding movement. Water moves. Boats move, people move. And the city had to function smoothly despite all this motion. Bridges became especially important. They connected islands, allowing pedestrians to travel through the city without boats. But bridges also had to allow boats to pass beneath them. Designing these structures required careful planning. Some bridges were built with gentle arches, giving small vessels room to glide underneath. Others were steeper, rising sharply above narrow canals. Each bridge responded to the specific needs of its location. In busy areas like the Grand Canal, larger arches were necessary. In quieter neighborhoods, smaller crossings were enough. The famous Rialto Bridge remains one of the most remarkable examples of this careful design. Its single wide arch supports shops and crowds of pedestrians while still allowing boats to pass below. When it was first proposed, many architects doubted it could be built successfully. The foundation beneath the canal was soft mud. The stone arch would be extremely heavy. But Venetian engineers trusted the technique that had worked for centuries. They drove thousands of wooden piles deep into the lagoon floor. Above those piles they built a solid platform of stone. And slowly the bridge rose above the canal. Today it remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in Venice. Another symbol of the city's ability to combine beauty with engineering. But perhaps the most interesting part of Venice's story is how its residents lived with constant uncertainty. The city was never completely safe from nature. Storms sometimes pushed enormous tides into the lagoon. Strong winds could raise water levels quickly. During these events, known as acqua alta, the streets of Venice temporarily filled with seawater. People adapted in creative ways. Raised walkways were placed across flooded squares. Shops used waterproof barriers to protect entrances. Residents simply learned to move through the city differently when the water arrived. It became part of life, a reminder that Venice was always connected to the sea. In modern times, engineers have attempted to reduce these floods using large movable barriers at the entrances of the lagoon. But for most of its history, Venice relied on its architecture and adaptability rather than massive mechanical systems. Buildings were designed to withstand occasional flooding. Important rooms were placed on higher floors. Ground levels often contained storage areas rather than living spaces. Once again, the city adjusted rather than resisting completely. This flexible approach helped Venice survive challenges that might have destroyed other settlements. And while Venice quietly refined its watery engineering, the rest of the medieval world continued exploring bold construction ideas of its own. In many European cities, the desire to build taller cathedrals pushed architects to invent new structural techniques. Stone vaults became more complex. Flying buttresses carried heavy loads away from fragile walls. Massive towers rose above town skylines. These cathedrals were not only religious buildings, they were also engineering experiments. Builders tested new ideas about weight, balance, and materials. Sometimes mistakes happened. Some towers collapsed during construction. Some vaults cracked under unexpected stress. But each failure taught builders something new. Over time, their designs improved. The same process occurred in castle construction. Early castles were often simple wooden forts built on hills. Later, stone walls replaced wood. Engineers added towers, gates, and defensive layers. Moats filled with water surrounded many castles, making them difficult to attack. Drawbridges could be raised to block entry. Narrow passageways forced attackers into vulnerable positions. These structures reflected a deep understanding of strategy and engineering. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, entirely different innovations appeared. In the Middle East and North Africa, advanced irrigation systems turned dry landscapes into productive farmland. In Asia, builders created enormous canal networks connecting rivers and cities across vast distances. In China, the Grand Canal became one of the longest artificial waterways ever constructed, linking northern and southern regions of the empire. Each civilization faced different environmental challenges. Each responded with unique engineering ideas. Yet Venice remained one of the most unusual examples. Because Venice was not simply improving its environment. It was living directly within one, a city built inside a lagoon. A city balanced on wood and stone above shifting mud. A city constantly listening to the rhythm of water. And as the night continues over the quiet canals, that rhythm remains gentle and steady. The tide moves softly beneath the bridges. Boats drift slowly beside the old palaces. Lanterns reflect across the water like small floating stars. And far below, in the silent darkness beneath the lagoon floor, the ancient wooden piles still hold their positions. They have supported Venice through storms and centuries. Through prosperity and change. Through the footsteps of countless generations. The hidden forest beneath the city remains patient, strong, unseen, continuing its quiet work as the lagoon breathes slowly around it.